I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 25, Operation Vengeance. Taylor County, Texas, Dyess Air Force Base. For a while, Colonel Webb thought they were going to evacuate everyone and everything out of Dyess to another air base. The ground fighting had become precariously close. There was a point where Webb could hear the thunderous booms of artillery and the soft whisper of machine guns chattering, which was a new and unique experience for him. His entire time in the military had been as a bomber, high above the actual fighting below. He'd never been on the ground in Afghanistan or Iraq to know what any of this sounded or felt like. His closest brush with death had been during the initial Iraq campaign in 2003, when the night sky around Baghdad had been lit up like the 4th of July. As to the current conflict, the Army had finally been able to stop the Chinese from advancing any further and had begun to push them back. Webb felt a certain satisfaction knowing that he had a major hand in all that. He and his co-pilot and a few other B-2 bombers had carpet-bombed the hell out of the enemy lines in Texas when things were looking pretty dire. Apparently, a few 1,500-pound bombs falling on the Chinese lines had finally stopped their momentum, at least for the time being. Now Colonel Webb and his co-pilot, Major Hawkey, found themselves sitting in an air-conditioned briefing room, looking over a new mission proposal. They didn't like it one bit. They had been assigned to fly to Alaska, where they'd link up with 2 B-2 bombers. The flight of 3 aircraft would then be refueled and carry out what was essentially a World War II-style terror bombing as they attempted to fly through some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. For this mission, the 3 bombers would each be outfitted with 80 500-pound dumb bombs to plaster the Chinese populace. Colonel Webb understood the reasoning, but it still seemed wrong. Colonel Webb raised his hand and interrupted the briefer. "Major, I have some serious problems with this mission that I feel need to be expressed. This mission does not fit within the parameters outlined in our laws of armed conflict. As the senior officer of this raid, I need to highlight that." The briefer acknowledged the question, shifting uncomfortably at the mention of the LOAC. The bomber and fighter bomber pilots had to adhere to these standards when carrying out a mission. It certainly wasn't standard operating procedure to unilaterally bomb civilian targets for the sole purpose of killing civilians. Brigadier General Ari stepped up to the front of the room and took the place of the briefer to address Webb's concern. "You are correct, Colonel. This mission would have been a direct violation of the LOAC. However, yesterday, by order of the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of the Air Force, the LOAC for the Global Strike Command have been amended." He paused for a moment, surveying the faces in the room. "What I'm about to tell you is highly classified. It's going to be released to the media soon, but until it is, you all are bound to secrecy." General Ari proceeded to give them the 10-cent version of what the Chinese had been doing in the occupied zones, the kidnappings, the starvation, and genocide. The information was devastating. Nearly everyone knew of someone or had family that was trapped in the occupied zones. To know that so many of them were being killed or starved to death was heartbreaking and disturbing. When everyone had had a moment to process what they'd just been told, General Ari continued. 4 days ago, the President issued an ultimatum to the Chinese government. They needed to cease the genocide of our citizens and begin the process of returning our people from China. If they failed to do that, then the U.S. would bomb their cities until they complied. That, gentlemen, is why the LOAC have been changed and why you've been asked to carry out this mission. We are going to bring the war to the Chinese people in hopes that their government will stop this genocide in the occupied zones. Colonel Webb still didn't feel good about the mission, but he understood why it needed to be done. He just hoped the Chinese would get the message and they wouldn't be forced to make this the new normal. 6 hours later, Colonel Webb took the plane off autopilot as they came into visual range of the KC-135 Stratotanker. "You got this, boss, or you want me to handle it?" asked his co-pilot, sounding a little too eager. Turning briefly to look at Hawkeye, Webb replied, "You know what, Hawkeye? Why don't you take this one? You'll be taking over command of an aircraft soon enough. Best for you to get ready to handle every aspect of the bomber." Webb had been doing his best to make sure his co-pilot was ready to take command when the new bomber started coming off the assembly line. Since there were only 2 of these planes in existence, the process to get pilots qualified to fly them was difficult. Hawkeye got them lined up behind the tanker, matching his speed and course. The boom operator's signal lights came on, letting him know he should move closer. Steadily, he inched the giant bomber toward the boom behind the refueler until it was just a few feet away from their open fuel receptacle. Now, he just had to hold the aircraft steady while the boom operator made a few adjustments on his end and then extended the fuel nozzle. A green light appeared near the boom operator. The 2 aircraft had successfully connected, and they'd now top off their tanks. It took a bit of time to take on all the fuel they needed, but eventually they were ready to disconnect and head to the next waypoint. After a few more hours, they skirted by Russia without being detected as they made their way towards South Korea. Then, they crossed over the Yellow Sea as they headed toward China's airspace. "I wish this old B-2 wasn't such a slow aircraft," Webb thought. The B-21 could travel more than twice as fast as the B-2, which meant they could have flown in and out of the hot zone a lot more rapidly. As the hours droned on, the trio of bombers finally reached visual range of mainland China. Webb could tell they were approaching China just by the level of smog in the air. Anywhere there was a densely packed city, the air above and around it was brown. The smog was thick, and it was like a plague covering much of the country. As they neared the coast, Webb and Hawkeye started to pick up numerous search radars. Their instruments told them the sky was being scanned by several HQ-9 or Red Banner 9 surface-to-air missile platforms in addition to several ground radar stations. The HQ-9s, however, were the real threat. These were state-of-the-art SAMs. They'd proven incredibly effective in the occupied zones of North America, having shot down more than 200 American aircraft thus far. When they officially crossed into Chinese airspace, the trio of bombers changed course slightly and adjusted their altitude. They flew a little lower, dropping down to around 30,000 feet as they entered the commercial aircraft flight lanes. The only thing showing on their radars at this point was a handful of commercial aircraft around 100 miles away. No fighters or other aircraft that could pose a danger to them. When they were less than 15 minutes from the drop zone, the trio descended from 30,000 feet to roughly 20,000 feet. Because they were dropping 500-pound dumb bombs, they needed to lower their altitude and speed a bit so they could do their best to keep the sticks of bombs relatively close together. The goal was to blanket an area with them for maximum damage. "We're 3 minutes out," Hawkeye stated over their internal comms system. "Stand by to open bomb bay doors," Webb announced. He hoped the other bomber pilots were moving in sync with him. He didn't want one of the bombers to release too early or too late. 60 seconds. Open bomb bay doors. Webb heard a slight mechanical sound, and then the aircraft started to buffet a bit from the wind and turbulence as they temporarily lost their sleek aerodynamic profile. Over the target in 5, 4, 3, 2, release, release, release. Colonel Webb held the bomber steady as Major Hockey issued the 80 bombs they were carrying. One by one, the 8 racks of 10 bombs fell to the ground below. The other bombers released their bombs in unison. Then the trio of aircraft picked up speed to the maximum a B-2 could travel and increased their altitude to 40,000 feet. Roughly 2 minutes went by before the entire horizon lit up with additional search radars. The PLA had probably detected the wall of bombs headed toward one of their major cities and knew the American bombers must be nearby. Time to split up, Webb thought. Each of the bombers split off on their own path of egress out of the area. Colonel Webb increased the throttle. They'd burn through a lot more fuel at this increased speed, but it'd get them out of Chinese airspace a hell of a lot faster. The PLA knew they were in the area, and they'd do their best to try and hunt them down, so it was no time to be concerned about fuel economy. 15 minutes after everyone headed off their separate ways, Webb's radar screen showed PLA interceptors taking off. "What kind of aircraft are those?" he asked, anxious to know what kind of trouble they might be in. "They look like J-8s, Hockey replied. "Finbacks, fast little buggers." As long as they don't get too close to us, we should be fine. "Okay, I want to keep a wide berth," Webb announced. "Make sure they never get more than 100 miles from us. Their radars are kind of crappy, but we don't need to make it any easier for them by letting them get near us." He noted down on his log what was happening. Hockey took a few minutes to enter the new parameters into their navigation computer. The technology would do its best to make sure they stayed outside the aircraft's radar range. The next 60 minutes was nerve-wracking and tense. Twice, Webb thought they had been found out, and twice he'd been proven wrong. Traveling at their maximum speed, they eventually reached the coast, and soon they were outside of Chinese airspace. As they moved further and further away from China, Webb slowed them down until they reached their optimum cruising speed and altitude. By his calculations, they'd be pretty low on fuel by the time they linked up with the refueler. Webb looked down at his watch. He figured they still had roughly 16 hours left in the air. That was a long time, but the hard part was over. Now they just had to stay awake while they flew home. Chapter 26. Traitors. Bedford, Massachusetts. Hanscom Air Force Base. Colonel Patrick "Paddy" Maine stood at the edge of the aircraft hangar with his hands on his hips. As the sun set, ushering in the night, he let a devilish smirk spread across his normally impassive face. "I like the dark," he thought. "It's when the real work gets done." He sniffed the air. Someone was eating clam chowder. The smell brought back a surge of memories from his childhood. Paddy's mother and father had both been very involved in his life, despite their hectic work schedules. His father had worked in consulting for a firm, and his mother had been a professor at Harvard. His father had been one of those alpha males in the corporate world, and had instilled a solid work ethic in him when he was young. His mother had been the polar opposite of his dad. She was an academic, a 50-pound brainiac. Her area of expertise had been applied physics. Between his mother's academic focus and his father's business savvy, they had trained him to be the best at both. With his mother being a professor at Harvard, he had had a slot reserved for him at the university. In the fall of 1996, Paddy started his first year at the Ivy League school, majoring in business and minoring in applied physics. He was in graduate school when tragedy struck in the fall of 2001. His father and mother had both been killed during the September 11th attacks. They weren't in the towers, though. They had been eating breakfast at a nearby restaurant when parts of the first plane that struck the building fell to the ground, killing them and half a dozen others. Patty was an only child, so his parents had been the only family he'd had. It was through that immense sorrow and loss that Patty had determined he wasn't going to go into the corporate world like his father. Instead, he had decided to join the military and exact some sort of revenge on those who had killed his parents. The Army had accepted him into the ROTC program at Harvard and had encouraged him to finish his MBA. He'd told them he wanted to go into Special Forces and didn't want to wait another year to finish grad school. The Army agreed to send him to Officer Candidate School and gave Patty a guaranteed slot in Ranger School. From there, it would be up to him how far he went in the Army. Patty had found that he loved the Army and the Rangers. He'd served 4 years with them before being recruited into the unit. From there, the rest was history. He'd been with Delta and inside JSOC ever since. Patty had been promoted to colonel and placed in charge of hunting down the remaining CDF and Tate administration officials, the last holdouts in putting down this rebellion within the country. To accomplish this task, he'd been given 1 squadron of Delta Force operators, a battalion from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, or SOAR, and a company of Rangers. While he desperately wanted to fight the Chinese, Patty knew his current mission was critical to holding the country together and ending the internal fight raging inside the country. After months of careful analysis, signals intelligence, and good old-fashioned human intelligence, the intelligence community had finally caught the break they'd been looking for, locating Congressman Tim Bork in Chicago. Through him, they'd found one cell leader after another. Now he'd led them to the second most wanted person in America, Paige Larson, former CIA operations officer and national security advisor to Senator Marshall Tate. Since the UN force had collapsed, she'd been busy recruiting and growing insurgent cells all across the Northeast, and in particular in Boston and New York. She was a key figure in keeping the Civil War alive. A voice broke into Patty's thoughts. "You ready for this mission, boss?" someone called. Patty turned slightly before he recognized the man who'd come up behind him, Lieutenant Colonel Kissinger, the commander of the 3rd Battalion, 160th SOAR. He was Patty's aerial support for this hunting expedition. Patty smiled at him. "It ends tonight, Kissinger," he responded. Kissinger nodded. "My guys are ready when you are." Patty looked at his watch. "Soon, my friend," he replied. "Just keep your crews ready. We should have the location narrowed down shortly." Kissinger tilted his head forward and to the right, as if silently saying, "Yes, sir." Then he walked back to where his pilots were milling about. The men were on edge with all the waiting, and they wanted to get this mission over with. Patty knew they wanted to get to the real fight, the battle against the Chinese for their homeland. Patty made his way into the ops center and looked around for his intelligence officer. Finding the person he wanted to see, he walked up to her. "Captain, what is the status of the safe house?" he asked. "Has Congressman Bork arrived yet?" She cocked her head to one side and shot him a disapproving look. "His convoy just entered the Dorchester neighborhood of South Boston. It won't be long now until we know which house. I've already got my people identifying LZs for the helicopters, and we've alerted Homeland of what neighborhood this is going to go down in." Captain Melissa Ortega was an extremely sharp woman. She'd graduated in the top 1% of her class at West Point 6 years ago, and gone on to become an intelligence officer in the 82nd Airborne, deploying to Afghanistan and Syria. When she'd been assigned temporarily to JSOC, Patty had immediately recognized her value and gotten her assigned to be one of his intelligence officers in his squadron. She'd done superb work, and in a number of situations, she'd utilized her gender as a strength to make headway where a man might not gain entry. Ever since then, Patty had made sure she was assigned to his unit every time they deployed. Patty held a hand up in mock surrender. "Sounds good. Just let me know when we have the safe house identified," he commented. "Everyone's ready to go when you tell us where." She nodded. "Copy that, Colonel. I'll get back to you shortly," she replied. Then she turned to go find the drone operator that was shadowing Congressman Bork's convoy. Looking around the room, Patty had to admire how quickly they had set up their base of operations. They had previously been operating in New York, but after 3 weeks of tracking Congressman Bork all over the Midwest, he'd finally led them here to Boston. Patty had had them move their operations to Hanscom Air Force Base so they could launch on a moment's notice and take both Larson and Bork into custody. Patty stood in front of a map of the city. He had a hard time wrapping his head around how everything had gone so wrong in his country. He'd grown up in Boston. It had been his home. "Excuse me, Colonel. We just got confirmation of the location of the safe house," Captain Ortega announced. Patty turned to face her. "Really? Where is it?" A smile spread on her face. "It's located here," she said, as she pointed to the neighborhood and the specific house they were meeting in. Patty furrowed his brow, then nodded for her to continue. "Congressman Bork's convoy pulled up to this house. He and his detail got out of the vehicles and headed inside. The automobiles are now camped out about a block away, ready to whisk him to safety if needed." "Okay. I'm going to round up the guys and our pilots," Patty said. "Get us some close-ups of the house and the area. Identify the LZs for the choppers, and have something ready for us in 10 mics. We don't know how long he'll be at the safe house, so we need to launch this mission ASAP." He turned around to go find his shooters and pilots and let them know they had a location. He wanted them suited up and ready to roll as soon as Ortega was ready to give them a down and dirty on the location they'd be hitting. The next 10 minutes saw a flurry of activity as the JSOC operators donned their equipment and headed to the hangar. Standing in the cavernous room, Patty could just make out the sound of helicopter rotor blades starting outside. When he looked at the men standing before him, he felt an immense amount of pride, knowing they were going to be the ones to finally put an end to this civil war. Patty walked up to the whiteboard. Once again, he scrutinized the pictures of the house they were going to raid and the surrounding area. Ortega had done a superb job of getting this put together so quickly. When he turned around, Patty saw that everyone had stopped talking as they waited for him to say something. "Men, tonight is it," he began. "Tonight, we capture not one but 2 of our 3 remaining high-value individuals. Congressman Bork has led us right to Paige Larson's safe house. However, that also means we'll have 2 security details to deal with." Some of the men grumbled a bit, but they largely held their tongues. "The mission hasn't changed. We just have a few extra hostiles to contend with. With regard to the security details, these aren't going to be some run-of-the-mill poorly trained bodyguards. These are ex-Spetsnaz and Canadian Special Forces. These guys know what they're doing, and they know how to fight." Patty turned his attention to his team leaders. "Team 4 is already en route," he explained. "They'll continue to stand by for the ground assault when we give them the go. Team 3 will land at the intersection of Vincent and Park Street. They'll move in on foot, closing off the west side of the neighborhood. Team 2, you'll land in the Doherty-Gibson baseball field and advance on foot to reinforce Team 4, who will be assaulting the front of the house. Team 3, you'll insert on the opposite street behind the objective, and then advance on foot to the rear of the house. This is it, gentlemen, the biggest mission of your lives. Are there any questions?" One of the operators raised a hand. "Colonel, has our air support situation changed?" he asked. Patty nodded. "It has. We've got one of these new upgraded AC-130Js for support, in addition to our Blackhawks. Beyond that, DHS has a team of 100 additional personnel on standby and a couple dozen bearcats a few miles away. Master Sergeant Bruce Deuce Wilder chimed in. I see you have your kit on, Colonel. I assume you're coming with us and not observing in the ops center. Boston is my hometown, and this is the mission that's going to end the Civil War. You're damn right I'm going with, Patty asserted. With no more time, the operators grabbed their weapons and headed out to the waiting Chinooks and Blackhawks. They were going in with their full unit, 28 Delta operators and 86 Rangers. Another 20 Rangers would be flown to the objective when the Chinooks returned from dropping off the first load. Paige stared at Congressman Timothy Bork for a moment before she quipped, "That's not good enough, Tim. We've got a nearly endless supply of money to pay people. Why are you having a hard time rallying additional support in the Midwest?" My groups continue to carry out attacks against DHS Gestapo forces from Milwaukee to Chicago, Detroit, on through to Toledo and Cleveland. That's a huge swath of territory, Paige, he retorted angrily. I wouldn't call it sitting on our hands. He ran his fingers through his hair. You also have to remember that I'm not a soldier. I'm a politician. Please don't remind me, she thought in frustration. Paige leaned in closer. It's still not enough, she insisted. You're talking about 5 major cities. And that's great that you've been able to keep the attacks going there, but you need that discontent and that willingness to take up arms to spread to more of the smaller and mid-sized cities. Right now, DHS is able to keep their forces concentrated where you're most active. We need to force them to contend with uprisings in dozens upon dozens of cities if we're going to keep this dream of President Tate's alive. She spoke with the passion and zeal of a true follower. Tim sat back in his chair and sighed audibly. Maybe you should speak with Admiral Hill about this, he suggested, his voice betraying his irritation. He's supposed to be training more of these special squads to go after the DHS forces. I have spoken with Admiral Hill, Paige countered. He's got small hit squads carrying out missions all over the Midwest, but it's you, our politician, who needs to keep rallying people to our side. Hill and I are the muscle, but you need to be our political face if we're to make this work, Tim. Tim let his breath out in a huff of frustration. Paige, I'm tired of living out of a vehicle. I'm tired of constantly being on the run. Marshall's already thrown in the towel. He's encouraged everyone else to do so as well. Why are we still fighting? What hope do we possibly have at achieving victory at this point? Paige took a deep breath in and held it for 5 seconds, trying to calm herself before she replied. She had to keep reminding herself that she needed this buffoon. Tim, we cannot achieve victory. Not since the UN force imploded. That much is true. What we are trying to attain at this point is concessions from the federal government. If they want this insurgency to end, then they need to agree to some of our demands. Why would the feds possibly agree to our demands? Tim questioned angrily. They're fighting the Chinese, and they've done a pretty damn good job of hunting down those of us who still remain. Paige spoke through gritted teeth. That's why you have to grow the insurgency in the Midwest, like I'm doing here in the Upper East Coast. We have to make this insurgency so costly to them that they'll agree to our demands so they can focus their entire attention on the Chinese. This is our best chance. You really think they'll release Marshall and give everyone involved clemency, a clean slate after all that has transpired? She shook her head in disgust. Of course I don't expect that. God, how could you have been a congressman and not understand anything about negotiations or leverage? Marshall's toast. We can't get him off the hook. Right now, I'm just aiming to get us off the hook. I'm also shooting to get a few of our other demands met, but we can't negotiate with them if we don't have a stronger hand. That's why I need you to do your best to get the insurgency to move beyond the cities where you've already stoked it. We need insurrection to rise up in the rural areas." Before the two of them could argue any further, Ethan Dawa, Bork's head of security, walked in hurriedly. He had a look of concern on his face. "Excuse me," he said, bowing slightly as a sort of apology for the interruption. "I just got an urgent message from one of my observers. A small group of helicopters just left Hanscom Air Force Base. He said they appeared to be heading northeast, but they could just be trying to throw off anyone observing the base." Paige wrung her hands. She had to think about that for a moment. It would certainly complicate things if the feds had somehow found them. "Ethan, keep an eye out, and let me know if you hear helicopters or anything out of the ordinary," she directed. "We'll be done talking in 5 minutes. Then you can get the congressman moved to our next safe house outside the city." Ethan nodded and then left the room. He held his secured handheld radio to his mouth as he began to issue orders. Paige started passing Tim information as fast as she could. He seemed to be taking most of it in, and he wrote down a few key points. They might need to talk more again at a later date, but right now, the best thing to do was change locations and separate. When Paige stood up, she and Tim walked over to the front room, where they exchanged some pleasantries. Then they bade each other farewell. Master Sergeant Bruce Deuce Wilder had just exited from the back of the Chinook when he heard the first string of gunshots. Without missing a beat, he sprinted toward the objective, which was less than 200 meters away. The crescendo of gunfire only increased as he got closer. Deuce saw the 4 SUVs for Team 4 parked in front of the safe house. The operators were aggressively engaging the shooters inside. As he neared their location, Deuce saw 2 of the Team 4 members get mowed down by bullets in the front yard. They had been trying to move up the stairs to breach the entryway. A new set of defenders appeared from across the street, firing into the backs of Deuce's comrades. Several of them were hit before they had a chance to seek cover. While Deuce continued his mad dash forward, he raised his Scar H rifle to his shoulder and squeezed off a short burst. He saw a string of his bullets tear into the side of the window frame. At least one of his rounds had hit one of the attackers. Deuce approached the back of a parked car on the side of the street, 2 houses down from the objective. He stopped long enough to level his rifle at the 2 other locations where the shooters were firing from and emptied the rest of his magazine into them. Shoving the now empty magazine into his drop bag, he grabbed his next one, slapped it in place, and hit the bolt release. Several of his guys ran past him now as they hurried to the aid of their comrades from Team 4. Deuce was about to join them when he saw more movement in the house he had just lit up. He called out to a couple of the guys from his team to follow him as he moved to clear the house. He wanted to make sure no one else got shot in the back like the assault team had. Deuce raced across the street. He made it to the center divider and stopped next to a large tree just as another shooter fired at him and his 3 comrades. Deuce waited 2 or 3 seconds before he popped around the right side of the tree and fired 2 short bursts from his Scar into the second-story window where the hostile was lurking. "Cover me!" shouted one of his guys. Deuce moved to the left side of the tree and dropped to a knee as he fired another controlled burst into the room where he knew there was another attacker. His magazine was empty, so he slapped a fresh one in place before he charged toward the house. 2 of his 3 comrades had already reached the porch and had begun stacking up on the sides of the entryway. One of them had wired the door to breach it before Deuce and his partner made it to the side of the house with them. "Breaching!" shouted one of the guys as he detonated the small charge affixed to the center of the door. The explosion blew the door apart. One of the other guys threw a flashbang in, and they waited a couple seconds for it to go off. Boom! The breacher on the team stormed into the house and turned to the first room on the right, with the second guy following behind him. Deuce and his partner then moved into the room on the left and proceeded to clear it. They progressed swiftly through the ground floor, spotting 2 dead attackers but no one else. Then they climbed the stairs to the second floor and began to clear the rooms up there. Again they found 3 dead bodies but no one else. Then Deuce heard something moving above them. He signaled to one of the other operators, who tossed a flashbang up the stairs to the entry of the next floor. It went off, rattling the house. One of the operators sprinted up the stairs with his partner hot on his heels. The first guy made it to the landing and turned to head down the hallway. Deuce was nearly to the top of the landing when he heard a string of gunshots followed by some yelling. He turned to head toward the commotion. Suddenly, an attacker exited a closet behind him and shot him squarely in the back. The bullet struck Deuce's rear plate and threw him to the floor, knocking the wind out of him. His partner swiftly swung his body around as he dropped to a knee and fired a string of bullets right over Deuce into the chest of the man who had just shot him. "Deuce, you okay?" his partner asked. Deuce shook the effects of the gunshot off, looked up at his friend, and nodded his head. Without waiting, his partner moved to clear the next set of rooms as the shouting, cursing, and shooting had ended in the room facing the street. When Deuce finally got to his feet, he walked into the room and saw one of the attackers lying on the floor dead, with a large knife stuck in his chest. One of his other teammates was sitting with his back against the wall and appeared to be a bit shaken. As he moved to talk to his teammate, Deuce heard the other 2 guys call out, "Clear!" Deuce kneeled down next to his comrade. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The operator just shook his head. "No, I'm not hurt. I've just never killed a guy with a knife before. I stared into his eyes as the life drained from his body." Deuce placed his hand on the man's shoulder. "It'll be okay. He didn't leave you any other choice. If you hadn't killed him, he would have murdered you and the rest of us. Put it out of your mind for the moment, and let's go help the rest of our team secure the safe house." The roar of gunfire coming from across the street was intense. It ebbed and flowed a bit, but it was certainly picking up pace right now, which meant the assault team had breached the house and they were now clearing it. Congressman Bork had just exited the front of the house when Paige heard an engine roaring down the block, which was followed by the sound of car brakes screeching and lots of shouting. Before she knew what was happening, several members of Bork's security team had practically thrown him back into the house. The guards out front opened fire on the vehicles, peppering them with bullets. All of a sudden, the panes of glass that had provided the living room with natural light shattered in front of them. One of her own guards tackled her to the ground. Bullets zipped over their heads, impacting against the wall and furniture next to them. "Quickly, to the basement!" shouted one of the Wagner private military contractors. The big Russian whipped out his FN P-90 submachine gun, spraying a barrage of armor-piercing rounds at several of the attackers as they ran toward the house with their own assault rifles, firing away. 2 of the attackers went down before the Russian was riddled with bullets and fell backwards, dead before he even hit the floor. Paige knew if she and Tim didn't get to the safe room right away, they were going to be either killed or captured in a matter of seconds. Turning to Tim, she yelled to be heard above the roar of gunfire. "Follow me to the basement!" Without waiting for acknowledgement, she turned and immediately started scrambling on her hands and knees, crawling out of the front living room toward the kitchen in the rear of the house. There was a stairwell there that led to the basement, where the safe room was located. She could call for help there. Paige turned to look down the hall as she motioned for Tim to get down the stairs. She saw one of the Canadian guards toss a grenade out the front door and then take a bullet to the head. Paige didn't even wait for the bang. She followed Tim down the stairs and made a beeline for the safe room. She slapped the emergency close button just as she heard the explosion from the grenade upstairs. The roar of gunfire above them picked up in pace, and so did the shouting. There were voices yelling in Russian and English as the 2 sides did their best to kill each other. Bangs and booms rattled the house as the attackers breached the front room. Paige grabbed the laptop in the room and turned it on. This was how she'd send out a call for help and keep an eye on what was happening above them. While she waited for the computer to boot, she glanced up at the congressman. The man was in shambles. He paced his end of the room like a trapped animal. When the laptop had finished its start sequence, Paige connected it to the internal and external video displays so she could get a grasp of what was going on. Then she shared the video feeds of the cameras on the social media platforms her various cells were using. Paige began to live stream to her groups. "People of the Boston CDF, now is your time to rise up," she began. "I need your help. As you can see, our fascist government is attacking my position as we speak. I need you to grab your friends and your weapons and come to my address and help kill these fascist pigs. Do not delay. I'm not sure how much longer my people can hold out." She turned the camera off and switched the screens back to monitoring what was happening in the house and around them. Paige tried to figure out how much longer they had left. Breaking her concentration, Tim asked, "Do you really think that quick message will help?" Without taking her eyes off the computer screen, she replied, "For our sakes, you had better hope so. If it doesn't, we're toast." From what she could see from the cameras, 2 of the attackers had breached the home. They were pinned down in the front room by a couple of guards, shooting down at them from the second-floor staircase. A couple more shooters had them pinned down from the library and the kitchen hallway. She changed the view to the outside cameras and saw 4 SUVs parked in front of the house with their doors open. That must be the initial assault force, she thought, wondering who else might be ready to show up. Paige saw 2 attackers lying dead on the ground not far from the stairs that led into the house. She surmised these must have been the 2 men her bodyguard had taken out before he was killed. Then she saw several more attackers dead in the street. She smiled when she realized her guards across the street in one of the other homes must have caught them in a crossfire before they knew where the shooting was coming from. Paige caught something. There was movement in the direction of the park. She took control of the camera and panned it to see where the action was. Her heart sank. She saw 2 CH-47 Chinook helicopters landing. They disgorged dozens of additional soldiers who were headed right for her location. The pace of the gunfire above them picked up. A couple of loud explosions rattled the safe room as the house shook from whatever had hit it. Then it suddenly grew quiet. Looking at the camera feeds, she saw a lot of smoke in various parts of the house and not much else. Some of her cameras had gone offline, probably destroyed by whatever had gone off upstairs. Then Paige saw a small cadre of soldiers moving through the house, systematically putting a bullet into the head of each defender's body to make sure they were truly dead. A group of them headed towards the stairwell, stopping just short of going down it. One of the soldiers tossed an object down and then stepped aside. She heard a loud boom outside the door of the safe room. The soldiers moved down the stairs. When they reached the bottom, they stopped in front of the safe room. The soldiers talked on their radio for a minute and then fanned out to search the rest of the basement. A couple of minutes later, a lone figure walked down the stairs. He made his way over to the metal door and then proceeded to pound on it twice. "We know you're in there, Ms. Larson," the man announced. "I'm asking that you come out and end this peacefully." "I think we should surrender," Congressman Bork blurted out. "They've clearly caught us, Paige." She shot him a disapproving look. "In less than 30 minutes, this entire place is going to be crawling with the cells I've created," she retorted. "It'll take them at least that long to cut through the door, so no, I say we wait it out." The man outside the door walked over to the camera. He took his helmet off and looked into it. "I know what you're thinking, Paige. I want to tell you there is no point in waiting. You're all alone, and no one is coming to save you." Incensed at this man's arrogance, Paige hit the 2-way talk button. "I've been live streaming this to my cells," she announced. "They're on their way, along with half of Boston." The man just smiled. It was one of those devilish smiles that said he knew something she didn't. "Ms. Larson, do you really believe we would have let you broadcast a message to the world?" Suddenly her chest tightened. Did they intercept my message? she wondered. A flurry of obscenities filled her head. "We hacked your internet, Ms. Larson. The message you thought went out to the world went straight to our ops center. As I said, no one is coming to save you. Now, I've been instructed to take you alive if possible. But if you are unwilling to surrender, then I'll burn this house down with you both trapped inside. It really doesn't bother me which way this goes down." The congressman looked utterly horrified. The thought of being burned alive was clearly more than he could handle. Paige crinkled her forehead. The man had used the word both. "It's just me in here," she countered. "No one else." The soldier cocked his head to the side and smiled. "Really? I could have sworn Congressman Bork was in there with you." Paige turned to look at Tim. "How could he have known you were here?" she asked. Tim just shrugged. "I'm a congressman, not an intelligence specialist. You tell me." She reached for a small metal device inside one of the drawers of the desk, turned it on, and then waved it across the congressman's body. As it got near his stomach, the indicator light flashed. A transmitter had been detected. In that moment, she knew exactly how they'd found her. They had somehow chipped Bork. Either he didn't know, or he'd cut some sort of deal. The soldier outside the door spoke again. "I suppose it won't hurt for me to tell you this, Ms. Larson. Perhaps it'll help you see reason and surrender. We placed a tracking device in Congressman Bork's food nearly 3 weeks ago. You don't have to believe me, but you've been playing this spy game long enough to know it's possible. Now why don't you come out of the room? Let's talk about your situation." Tim reached for the arm of the chair as he sat down shakily. Judging by the look on his face, he was oblivious to what had been done to him. Paige's stomach sank. How many rebel leaders did he meet with during the last 3 weeks? Paige asked herself. She wondered how many of them had likely been arrested as a result. "It's over, Paige," Bork said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We did everything we could. Sometimes you just lose." Paige was filled with rage. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I wasn't supposed to get caught. With her and the congressman out of the game, that meant only Admiral Hill was left. She suddenly felt lightheaded. "Did you meet with Admiral Hill in the last several weeks?" she asked. Congressman Bork's face became ashen. He didn't say anything. He just hung his head low and cried into his hands. It truly is over then, she thought. She shook her head in anger. Paige reached behind her back and slipped her hand under her shirt, feeling for the Kimber 1911 she always carried. She pulled it out, and while the congressman was crying in his hands, she shot him in the head. Then she put the gun to her own head and pulled the trigger. Patty heard 2 gunshots emanating from within the safe room and just shook his head. He knew it was over. They had killed themselves rather than surrender. Damn, he thought. Why didn't we know about the safe room? One of the soldiers came up to him. "Colonel, do you want us to cut our way into the room?" Patty just nodded, not taking his eyes off the steel door that stood between him and the 2 most wanted Americans. "Yeah, get it opened up," he replied. "We need to recover their bodies, if nothing else." Then he turned and walked back up to the ground floor of the home. Everywhere Patty stepped, the floor was covered in spent shell casings. The walls were riddled with bullets and adorned with the occasional splattering of blood or brain matter. Bodies were everywhere, and the floors were nearly covered by pools of blood. Patty exited the house, and one of the captains walked up to him. "Sir, you asked for our losses," the man said. Patty nodded. 6 KIA, 11 wounded. The area is secured." Patty shook his head at the losses. Damn it. We shouldn't have lost that many people. "Has the SSC team arrived?" Patty asked. I want this place combed over for evidence, especially their laptops, thumb drives, and cell phones." "They're arriving on the next Chinook," the captain replied. "We'll be flying our wounded out as well. Oh, the DHS supervisor told me he's deployed his QRF team to help us keep this place on lockdown. It won't take long for what happened here to get out. There could be trouble in a few hours." Patty nodded. "True. Make sure the SSE team knows they need to hurry. Grab everything if we have to. We can always exploit it back at the base." Then he walked back to the baseball field. He wanted to check on some of his wounded before they were flown out. It was the least he could do as their commander. York County, Virginia, Camp Peary. After an hour-long briefing with his analytical team, Major General Lancaster was finally alone in his office. He lay down on a couch as he tried to process everything he'd just been told. They'd gone over the results of hundreds of raids being conducted across numerous states. It was a massive dragnet at this point. If all went well, it'd either end the Civil War entirely or seriously slow it from spreading further. A little more than 3 weeks ago, they had succeeded in chipping Congressman Bork. He had unwittingly led them to more than 30 CDF militia leaders and cells across the Midwest. But more importantly, he had led them to the location of retired Admiral David Hill, the true mastermind of the insurgency. As each militia leader or cell had been identified, the NSA and FBI did their best to not only track their movements, but identify and monitor everyone they were coming into contact with. Lancaster, along with the National Security Team at the White House, had determined they'd hold off on arresting everyone until they had Congressman Bork and Paige Larson in custody. That way no one could be tipped off that they had been discovered. Within 48 hours of the raid on Paige Larson's safe house, they had apprehended more than 500 militia leaders and members, including Admiral Hill. Now the FBI was running through the interrogations of the individuals arrested. A few of the more significant leaders had been handed over to Lancaster and his task force. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was going to have his hands full interrogating Admiral Hill. Hill had been a Navy SEAL his entire life. The man had been specifically trained to resist during an interrogation. The issue Lancaster and his team were facing now was what to do about the previously unknown information about this shadowy group of people who seemed to be pulling the puppet strings of the world. It was almost mind-numbing to think about. If Lancaster didn't pay close attention, even he could get lost in all the layers and webs of this global conspiracy. Mitchell had been peeling back one layer of this onion after another with Eric Jahn. While he continued to believe these were largely compartmentalized discussions between Seth and a few others, they'd been vetting everything, checking every lead and connecting every dot. The longer Seth debriefed the man, the more they found. Something didn't sit well with Lancaster. During one of Seth's calls on the secured line, he'd mentioned something that sent a chill down Lancaster's spine. Seth had mentioned a case he'd worked in Iraq when he was still assigned to a Special Forces ODA team. The tribal chief in the Diyala province had told me he could deliver many of the al-Qaeda leaders in the country, along with people who were working with the Iranian Quds Force, which was part of the IRGC, Seth had shared. While the man was providing valuable, accurate intelligence, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was just having us round up his enemies, so he'd have an easier time consolidating power once he was released by coalition forces. All right, Seth, how does this relate to our current situation? Lancaster had asked. I feel like Eric Jahn might be doing the same thing with us. That's why he's being only too eager to cough up the names of so many people involved in this conspiracy. As Lancaster was lying there on his couch, thinking about what to do next, His eyes slowly closed, and before he knew it, he was down for the count, asleep before his mind or body could fight it. This has been Vengeance, the Falling Empires series, Part 4. Written by James Rosone and Miranda Watson. Narrated by B.J. Harrison. Copyright 2020 by James Rosone. Production copyright 2020 by James Rosone.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.